Engaging the blind. Who are the blind? The first thing to realize is that the blind don't think they are the ones who are blind. So maybe your eyes are open and you are seeing things clearly, or maybe you are the blind person who thinks everyone else is blind because they don't see things the way you do. And remember, the obvious isn't obvious anymore. And that is not the fault of the blind person. So again, don't enter any conversation thinking you are the seeing person and the other person is automatically the blind person. We have to question everything, remember? Even why we think the way we do. When we engage in difficult conversations, we have to understand that the algorithms have been curated very carefully in order to get the typical average person believing that everyone else pretty much believes the way they do on everything. So when they encounter someone who thinks something different than they do, the automatic reaction is to believe the person that disagrees with them is blind, stupid, an outlier, etc. So first, when I talk about engaging the blind, do not argue and do not assume that you have all the answers and they have none. The real question is, how should we engage those who disagree with us, who seem blind to the destruction of society? How do we impact with truth and change closed minds? We have very little control over who governs us or how. Although we might be able to demand answers from those promoting policies, ask them what their goals are and how their ideas will help achieve those goals, and we may be able to point out hypocrisy, such approaches never really change minds and hearts. The keyboard warrior and Twitter troll use this type of confrontation all the time, and the replies indicate such engagement usually leads to everyone digging in their heels and entrenching themselves in their belief systems and party affiliations and leaning into their anger-filled desperation. Instead, we should cultivate relationships and become true friends to those around us. And then, when something comes up, be ready to ask questions. But this method of engagement takes courage and real curiosity. We need to walk into every interaction without any need to be right and with every intention to simply be curious. Why do you think that? Where did you hear that? Does that make sense to you? Why does that make sense to you? Why do you think others might believe the opposite? What if what the other side is saying is true? What if all the sources are lying to us? Why might those in power want us to believe that? What do you think the goal should be? What should reality look like if what you are saying is true? What would reality look like if the opposite of what you are saying is true? What truths does our reality reflect right now? What are some premises that might make such a statement false? What are some alternate premises for that conclusion? Is that the reason they gave? If not, why do you think that is the reason? Do you really believe that? There are endless curiosity questions that can be asked and thought of when one is genuinely curious. The best part about this approach is everyone learns something. If you are asking the questions and truly listening to the answers, you are learning about the other person, how they think, what they believe and why, and how best to connect with them to create and cultivate an authentic friendship. And the person answering the questions is learning about themselves as well. And yes, you should be asking all these questions of yourself as well. You have to be willing to be humble enough to say things like, I never thought of it that way before. I'll have to give that some thought. That is a good point. Fair enough. Even, you've given me a lot to think about. And yeah, you might just learn something about yourself as well. Never make this about winning an argument. Remember, don't argue. Ask the question and engage with their answers. Don't look for an opening to contradict them or point out a fallacy. Never make this about being right. In fact, come up with all possible answers, even ones you don't like, for why something might be said or done, and consider all of them. Always be ready to say, especially if they ask you what you think, be ready to say, I don't know, I'm not sure, and I'm still thinking about it. You could even add, which is why I am so curious about what you think on these things and where you get your information. I want to glean from as many sources as possible before coming to any conclusions. This approach forces us into a position of humility and forces the other person to examine their own hearts and beliefs in a way they may never have done so before. Another way to engage the blind, I think, is to just let them talk. There are just some people who will barrel right over you in a conversation anyway, and just let them. You are learning about them and the way they think. And if something really strikes you and you don't have the chance to ask a question, bam, there is another conversation opener for the next time you talk to that person. But truly listen and remember things they said. Don't be like half listening, just enough to be gearing up for your argument against everything they just said. Don't get into defensive or attack mode. Truly make it about getting to know the other person better. And this builds trust too. And once the relationship is in place, if something truly important comes up that you feel compelled to warn them about, because you've been a good friend with a relationship that was built over time, they're more likely to listen to you about that very important thing. And yes, this is a slow and steady approach, and it takes a lot of time. But as they say, Rome wasn't built in a day, and we are not going to rebuild this society or reweave the fabric of American society back together overnight. We need to engage people in a slow and steady approach to build trust and authentic relationships. We cannot change anyone's mind by constantly contradicting and fighting them. We will not change any hearts through insults and shouting over them. And even if we get exasperated when others don't see what is so obvious to us, nothing is gained through exasperation. Decide beforehand to remain at peace and shift any such exasperation into compassion and kindness.